All right. I think people are slowly getting on, but I want to make sure we have enough time to cover everything. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Hi, I'm Shannon Dyson. I'm the Assistant Director for TAP. We are a state-funded grant that has 15 partners across the state of Illinois, which provide assessment and treatment for children on the spectrum throughout our state. And thanks, Sabrina. And so, of those 15 partners, we have 4 universities and 11 service centers, as you can see here in this picture. Not all of the centers offer the same services, but across the state, we have a wide variety of services for everybody. Also, one of the things that we pride ourselves in is a lot of training and education, which is why this training series is being hosted. And so we are happy to partner with Breaking Autism in order to talk more about special education, and specifically tonight talking about understanding your rights in special education in the process. I'm going to let Sabrina and Judy take it from here and start everything off, if that sounds good. Oh, I forgot to mention, I am going to post a survey in the chat. And I just asked all that are participating to fill that survey out. For location, indicate the central office for the Autism Program of Illinois, and that it's a training for your service. This feedback really helps us. We have to share this information with the state to continue our funding and to get feedback about all the things that we're hosting. So any input would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, TAP. We're so excited that you're here today. We have a ton to cover. Today we're going to cover just the fundamentals of special education. So welcome. If you're new to special education, want to get a primer on fundamentals, or frankly, just have some questions, this is the spot for you. So we're going to cover a lot today. As always, if you've been part of our webinar series, or follow us on YouTube and join our webinars there, you are used to jam-packing all things into an hour. So we're excited you're here today. Let's get started. So quick overview, I'm sure you know us. If not, reach out to us. We'd love to tell you more. But for now, I'll give you the quick heads up. My name is Sabrina Shafer. I'm a special education attorney. I have a fairly extensive background in behavioral analysis, and now work with Phil Milsk, a special education attorney, former hearing officer, which is really important. Hearing officer is a special education judge effectively, and so he's got a wealth of knowledge on what, from a legal perspective, but also from an advocacy perspective. And of course, the one and only Miss Judy Ruffulo. I always like to say 20 plus years because I don't think I can legally share how many years she's been at it. Just kidding. But I like to give her a hard time for it. Let's say 20 plus years to have a good time with it.
That works.
There you go. Special education extraordinaire. There is not a situation she hasn't been a part of and frankly has been very successful at. So welcome, Judy. Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started. We've got a packed agenda. You would expect no less from the Breaking Autism team. So all things fundamental today. We're going to go, fairly quickly, but we're going to go through the fundamentals. If you have questions, make sure you post them. Or frankly, if something comes out afterwards, just email us. We promise that we will always get back to emails. We will always get back to you. I know a lot's going on, so make sure you take notes. And let's get started. We're going to talk about fundamentals around special education and legal rights, eligibility and evaluations. By the way, if you don't know what that means, it's a term and we'll explain it. We'll talk about IEP components and writing IEP goals, some additional resources, and if we've got time at the end, some Q&A. So let's get started. So the absolute core fundamental, regardless of where you are in the U.S., because as you know, we're here today with TAP of Illinois, so a lot of this is going to have an Illinois slant to it, but there's a federal basis for special education, and that basis is what we call the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Sometimes you hear it called IDEA, sometimes you call it IDEA. And the reason we're starting here is, first and foremost, it is the most important of all of the protections. So this is the absolute floor. States cannot go below this. They can always go above it and do more. But regardless of what state you're in, this is the fundamental. So you absolutely must know this. And if you walk away with nothing else, if you've got to leave tonight or whatever it might be, this is your takeaway. So, ready for some desensitization? I intentionally put this up here to scare you because we know that a lot of times, in fact, we were all just sharing a couple stories, a lot of times things like this, like the law, the language of the law, are shown and thrown up to parents, whether binding or not, we'll talk about that later, and it's very intimidating. So what we're doing is a little bit of desensitization, but also let's break it down for you. I like to keep things really simple. The way the IDEA breaks down your federal rights in special education is this way. So it ensures that children with disabilities have a free and appropriate education that emphasizes both the related services and special education, right? But get this, designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for these three things. Again, I hope you're writing this down. This is the absolute fundamental central piece of special education. Special education is designed to prepare a student for further education, employment, and independent living. So if you hear anything else, like that's a functional goal or that's a living, life skills goal, that's irrelevant. From a federal protection standpoint, an appropriate education is designed to meet a child's unique needs based on those three things. So I hope I didn't scare you too much, but now you are a pro. That's really it. That is the basic fundamentals to special education from a federal perspective. So let's talk about, kind of dive in a little bit deeper around fundamentals and legal rights.
All right. So our first item here kind of recaps that last slide. It's, that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, I refer to it as IDEA, so you'll probably hear that a lot. The full title is a mouthful and people confuse IDEA with something else. So anyway, but the basis of it again is that it establishes those rights for children and parents that the children with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. And we cannot stress this enough, designed to meet their unique needs. So it's about what your child needs, not what someone else's needs. It's not a district that says, we don't do that here, we don't do this. It's about your child and their needs, okay? So, number 2, what is special education? So I think a lot of people would answer that question that, well, that's where they put kids who can't really learn the same, and so they go in this classroom. Well, special education is not a place, okay? Special education is specialized instruction and related services. So it's instruction and services to prepare students for 3 things. And by the time your child gets through school, you've got to have these memorized because, we start a lot of times in early childhood and we're going all the way through what we call transition, a lot of times till they're 22 years old. But special education has to prepare students for further education. So in other words, to go on to college or trade school or whatever it is that they choose after high school, employment and independent living, okay? Those are the 3 purposes. That is the basis of the IDEA and what they're supposed to be providing your child and preparing them for, okay? And then the final issue here is that there's an entire continuum of placement and services. I mean, we could talk about this all night, but the point really is that again, you're focusing on your child's unique needs. It's what your child needs. And so that continuum of placement services, we're going to go into it a little bit deeper. You'll hear that a lot in IEP meetings. You know, districts will talk about what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate, but in many cases, you're going to have to be the one to actually do that research and figure out what the different placements are, how they differ from each other, how the instruction is delivered, the services that are offered, and all of those things, so that you can be sure that your child is getting literally everything that they need to prepare them for life after school. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that.
Thanks, Judy. That is so important. I hope you are screenshotting this. Take a picture. By the way, this presentation and recording will be available, but this is so critical to really grasp. And by the way, quick spoiler alert, there may or may not be a pop quiz at the end with some really juicy prizes. So make sure you're taking notes, not to mention, you know, your child's benefit. That's important. So let's talk about, again, just from a high level, some core concepts to the IDEA or to special education as we know it, because you're going to hear some of these. And, you know, if you haven't figured out already, you'll quickly learn. There is an alphabet soup of acronyms in special education. So I want to get you acclimated to what those terms are, and then just from a fundamental standpoint, what they really mean. So first and foremost, you've heard us talk about this, right? A child with a disability is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as FAPE. So I'll say that again, a free and appropriate public education, which is referred to as FAPE. And that's really fundamental, because a lot of times, if there is a special education dispute, it comes down to whether or not that education was actually appropriate for the child. And we won't go into too much around what appropriate means, because there's been tons of litigation around that. But effectively, right, we know that under the IDEA, appropriate means instruction and services that meets your child's needs, right? So from a high level, courts have unanimously decided and determined that a child must make meaningful progress. You can't just make de minimis, you know, lacking or very minimal progress. There has to be meaningful progress. And of course, you know, it emphasizes the, like we talked about, the special education related services that meet the child's unique needs, right? Preparing them for those three things. And I'll say them again, because science shows us you got to hear something 7 to 11 times to remember it. It's supposed to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And the free part is that it's supposed to be at no cost to parents or guardians. And so if you're paying for ABA or private speech, OT, now all of that from a supplemental standpoint, you know, to supplement your child's education is absolutely fine. If it's because your child's not receiving an appropriate education, that's the difference. It's very, very different. So that's FAPE. If you've got questions, I know we're covering a lot and we're covering it fairly fast. Make sure you reach out, write them down so we can get these answered. Next, let's talk about evaluation or an appropriate evaluation. So we'll talk about sort of the eligibility. How do you get eligible for special education if your child isn't already? But there's multiple times in a child's special education career where they will seek an evaluation. And so from a very high level, here's what you have to know about evaluations. First and foremost, the law is very clear about this. A child's evaluation, whether it's their initial evaluation or what's called an annual review, a regular evaluation that's part of the IEP process, they must be evaluated in all, not some, all areas of suspected disability. Suspected doesn't mean it's determined. That's what the evaluation is for. So if you suspect that your child has a disability or has some areas of need, make sure you're putting that in writing. Make sure you're requesting that, because it's so important that you really understand the child's holistic needs in order to be able to prioritize and address them appropriately. So an appropriate evaluation, by the way, also includes a variety of evaluation materials. So there isn't one data point. So a lot of times we hear this, districts will say, well, we observed your child in the classroom and she doesn't need this, or she needs this. That's one data point. So an appropriate evaluation considers a variety of evaluation materials. By the way, evaluations, when they're appropriate, cannot be racially or culturally discriminatory. That seems like table stakes, but I'm going to mention it anyway in case that's your case or happening in your situation. And last but not least, again, we'll talk about the timeline, but from a very high level, some takeaways, what you have to know about evaluations. When it comes to an initial evaluation, from a federal standpoint, what the IDEA says is that districts have 60 days from the day the parent signs for consent to evaluate a child. If you're in Illinois, the school code requires 60 school days. So if you're outside of Illinois, make sure you're checking what your state says, because that can be the difference between having to evaluate over summer versus having to evaluate, during the school year while it's in session. So make sure you check on that. Or if you have questions, make sure you're writing them down and let's address them. So that's the high level for appropriate evaluations. Next, of course, you've heard our favorite acronym, IEP, an Individualized Education Program. Sometimes you'll see a Individualized Education Plan. What you need to know about IEPs is they are dictated by the IDEA. So make sure when you understand the fundamentals of what that means, right? Unique needs, preparing them for those three things, specialized instruction, and related services. There needs to be, the IEP needs to address all identified areas of need. That doesn't mean always that there's a goal for every identified area of need, but a lot of times, as a formal behavioral analyst, you can work on multiple areas of need within one goal. But a lot of times we hear this, well, your child already has 3 goals, or your child has the maximum number of goals. By the way, no such thing. If you hear that, red flag, call Judy. And it's a legal document. It is truly like a contract. And so if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So if your child needs a specific specialized instruction, maybe they need a multi-sensory, intervention, or maybe they need some type of training to help them, sensory diets, you name it, that needs to be part of the IEP, because that is your legally binding document. And one other last note on IEPs, they are legally binding. A remote learning plan is not. If you're involved right now with something called a remote learning plan, make sure you check out our part 1 of the series, which is up now on the Breaking Autism YouTube channel. We go extensively through the differences between an IEP and a remote learning plan, or an RLP. They are very different, and the most important thing you must know is your IEP is what's legally binding. Focus on your IEP. If you're hearing somebody say, oh, you've got to go to a remote learning plan, that is absolutely not true. Focus on your IEP. This is my absolute #1 thing that I harp on. The law requires that parents have meaningful participation. And meaningful, by the way, there's a whole series on this, or a whole video on this on the YouTube site as well, where parents really have the right to be a meaningful participant. So in Illinois, as of July of this year, we just passed a law that parents have to be provided their IEP draft IEPs 3 days prior to the IEP meeting. Check your local listing or your local laws as well to make sure that you're given enough time to really process and prepare for meetings. That also means regular access to records, right? Being able to observe your child, being able to bring in people from your private team into an IEP meeting. So meaningful participation is one of the most powerful tools parents have, and one of the most underutilized tools. So really make sure you're looking at that. It's an equal partnership in the decision-making process. It's not a vote where, you know, a lot of times I'll even see this in IEP where it'll say, the IEP team decided this. And what they really meant was the school district decided this. You are part of the IEP team. So make sure that your input is being accounted for. Make sure that you're getting the information you need to make informed decision about your child's future and education. And one last thing on that is at 14 and a half years old, a child is invited to an IEP meeting. Just a quick caution or cautionary on that. This is where districts tend to pit students against their parents. And I know, Judy, you're probably shaking your head going, yes. So make sure you are prepared for that, and really understand what your child needs before walking into an IEP, especially at that time milestone. One other thing that we're going to talk about is procedural safeguards. Now, our next session, the next part of this series in 2 weeks, is completely on procedural safeguards. But from a high level, let's talk about them now. That's that packet you get either, or you should get before or after your IEP meeting. And the purpose of procedural safeguards, I know it's a big legal name to sound important, but really all it is a truncated list of special education rights. And the purpose is to ensure that rights of students with disabilities and their parents are protected. So make sure you read through it and you reference it. And by the way, we will touch on dispute resolution as well later today, so we're not going to go into that too much now. But make sure you really do read that procedural safeguard packet that you get, because it's so, so important. And the very last term you're going to hear, at least right now, is something called LRE, least restrictive environment. So Judy, help us unpack what is an LRE? What is the least restrictive environment?
All right. All right. So I talked earlier a little bit about what is called the continuum of placement options. And so where that comes from is really least restrictive environment. So the law is very clear that students with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the extent possible. So that means that's where that least restrictive environment comes from, that we should be educating children with their non-disabled peers to the extent possible. So the least restrictive environment for your child is going to be different than it is for someone else's child, and it's going to be different than, it may change over the course of your child's educational years. Sometimes, you know, kids with a lot of behaviors will require a more restrictive environment. But then as they get older and they learn to regulate themselves, we may, you know, have them more out in the general education. So I think it's probably easiest if we just pull these out, Sabrina, all at once, and then I can kind of compare top to bottom rather than go into a ton of detail. So what the triangle really, you know, denotes is that the least restrictive environment, or the bottom part of that triangle, would be where most kids get their education, which would be in the regular, what we call a general education classroom. So part of the IEP process is determining where your child will receive their special education, where they will receive their services, and that's placement. I can tell you that placement is one of the most common areas of dispute in special education. It's very common that districts and parents do not agree about where your child should be placed, especially a little bit of a more seasoned parent. Generally, the way this works is that at first you're very comfortable, you're very trusting, and you know, whatever they think is best, you're okay with. And then you start seeing that maybe your child needs more. Maybe your child needs more intensive instruction than they can get. Maybe they need less. Maybe you want them to have more exposure to gen ed peers. Parents all feel differently about this. Not everyone is going to have the same opinion, but the main point here is that you are a part of that IEP team, and your opinion about what's best for your child or what's appropriate for your child is part of that placement decision. So if we just run through these quickly, the least restrictive environment is going to be the general education classroom. From there, we go into, now the model is called co-taught, and a lot of you may have heard that. It's a classroom and there's two teachers in there. One is a gen ed teacher, one is a special education teacher, and the instruction is delivered by the both of them. It's when it's done well, it's a beautiful thing. It's very seamless. You wouldn't know which teacher is which, and all of the children are being supported. So it's a great inclusion model. And then we have a regular classroom with other instruction and services, which is similar, but a little bit more towards that next step up, which is that resource model. And so in the resource model, the child is spending a good part of their day in the general education classroom, but they're getting pulled out, maybe for reading instruction or maybe for math instruction, maybe getting some of their service minutes. And now we start getting really more restrictive, a separate classroom. So your child goes to public school, but they're in a special education classroom for the better part of the day. And so the disadvantage to that is they don't have very much exposure to their typically developing peers, which research has shown over and over and over again that children that are educated in less restrictive environments have better outcomes. Children model each other. And so, you know, that should always be where we start looking at placement. So after a separate classroom, it could be a separate school. Sometimes you've heard them called therapeutic day schools. That's usually how they're called. These are private schools. They are not public schools, but the school district pays the tuition for the child to attend a special day school. And a lot of where they go depends on the child's disability and their individual needs, because different therapeutic day schools only serve certain categories of children with learning disabilities, autism, what have you. And then we get into what's considered highly restrictive, which would be residential placement. This would be for a child who absolutely could not live at home and go to school. Frequently, these are kids with significant emotional disabilities, or sometimes cognitively just not able to control behaviors and things like that. And then most restrictive is homebound or hospitalization. So, you know, in those cases too, you know, a lot of times districts will tell you, well, that's not a placement. It is a placement. Homebound is a placement, and your child is entitled to receive services in their home if that's what they need in order to make progress. So that is the whole continuum of placement options on your child's IEP. But the first place we need to be looking is general education, that least restrictive environment, and then what can we not provide for them in that environment? And then we start looking at what we need to pull them out of general education for, okay? And in some cases, you know, it truly is that they need something very restrictive. Remember, we want our kids to make progress, and we want to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. And if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. And all of these are covered under the IDEA and are part of it. So.
And as you can imagine, Judy, as you mentioned, it's based on your child's unique needs. And as you can imagine, sometimes, depending on the child's needs and situation, there might be a hybrid of these. There truly is a complete continuum that really represents how a child can receive special education. So, I warned you, da, da, da. Pop quiz. We're gonna go on the honor system today. Typically we like to use something called Kahoot, but in the interest of just brevity, since we don't have a ton of time today, we are going to go on the honor system. So if you get these right, you are welcome to reach out to us, and we are willing to go through an IEP review with you and go through really any recommendations that we have on your IEP, and you would be surprised. So with that, let's get started with our pop quiz. All right, so let's see how well you've been paying attention. It's a trap. A potty training. Can potty training be an IEP goal? Why or why not? We should have inserted like the music, you know, dun, dun, dun. All right, why or why not? I'll give you a few seconds to think through it. Can potty training be an IEP goal? Why or why not? And let's see the answer. We won't keep you in suspense too much longer. Yes, it absolutely can, right? Because we've only said it a few billion times by now. There are 3 things that an IEP in special education is supposed to prepare a student for. We already know them. You're probably saying them with me. Further education, employment, and independent living. So appropriate potty training and bathroom skills are absolutely necessary for independent living, not to mention a whole plethora of other things as relates to employment and even education. So a goal may be appropriate. Don't let anyone tell you any otherwise. We hear this potty training, shoe tying, washing hands. Sometimes, by the way, we get the opposite where, you know, there's all these sort of filler goals like, you know, reading a clock when really the child needs to learn how to time manage. So make sure that if you have a goal, that it really hits the priorities that make sense for your child. And if one of those priorities is, for instance, a potty training goal or a dressing goal or any kind of functional or otherwise goal, know from a federally legal standpoint, it absolutely could be appropriate for your child and could be included in your IEP. All right.
Looks like we had a few parents in our chat who were right on that because they've been down that road with their own kiddos. So yeah, that's, yeah, I had one last week who told me that zipping a zipper was not an IEP goal. So, but it really is because it's in the child's IEP now. So it's official. Okay, so let's try another one, all right? If your district does not have a classroom set up where it's co-taught, where there's a special education and a general education teacher, but that's what's appropriate for your child, should the school have to provide that placement? Why or why not? So we have someone in our chat saying yes. Yes, because of FAPE.
Ah, okay.
IDEA. These guys are paying attention to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So your child with you know, with an IEP is entitled to FAPE in the least restrictive environment. So it's if it's appropriate that that's the type of services or instruction that they need, then yes, the district has to provide it.
Exactly.
If they can't provide it, they need to find a way to do that. They simply need to provide your child what they need, what meets their unique needs. And when someone chimed in with, if they're offering something just as good, even if it's different, that's good too. Yeah, I mean, I like working with districts who are creative and are able to come up with different ways to get to the same end. But if it's what a child needs because that's what's decided, or you know, that's what the evaluations show, there you go. Yes, they must do it.
And this is, you know, like you said, Judy, it's not, well, the district doesn't have it, or these are the only classrooms we have, or a lot of times what I have is districts will not provide any documentation on their placements. They'll be willing to talk to you about it or talk about it at an IEP. I need to see, and I always, you know, maybe I'm just a slow processor. I don't care. I will take it. I need to see physically what is that classroom going to look like. And I want to know about it in writing, not just in an IEP meeting or a phone call. Again, remember, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So that's exactly it. It doesn't matter what the school has or doesn't have available to it, or what kind of programs they've already set up. It depends on your child's unique needs. All right, last one. Your school district says that your child does not need speech therapy, saying it isn't part of his disability because he speaks a different language in the home. Ah, see, we try to trick you here. Do you have to pay for speech to come to school or work with your child outside of the school hours? So do you have to pay for speech either to come into the school or to work with your child at home or in the clinic for out of school hours? Yes or no? Your child needs speech therapy, but they're saying it's not part of their disability because he speaks a different language in the home. All right.
Okay.
Let's see. Ah, no, not likely, right? The IDEA affords children with special needs a free and appropriate special education based on their unique needs. So once a child's been identified as a special education student, it doesn't matter what the cause of the need for a goal or related services is. So again, I hope you're screenshotting this. Even as an attorney, I have districts come to me and try to pull, you know, interesting things. Causation, what's causing the child's need, may be part of the evaluation, right? You might want to understand better so that you can help address the need. It may be part as identifying appropriate treatment, services, approaches, or interventions, but it's irrelevant as it relates to a child's IEP and them being able to get related services in that area. So causation may be considered or part of, you know, the identifying the appropriate services and such, but it's irrelevant when it comes to whether or not the child receives that service from the district. All right. Very good, very good. I'm seeing some good answers, so nicely done. All right, so let's talk about eligibility and evaluations.
All right. Okay, so number one, what do you do if you suspect your child needs special education? What do you do? Okay. I think if the first thing I would say is you want to request that evaluation in writing. Okay. Don't tell the teacher about it at teacher conferences. Don't call them up. Don't call the principal. Put it in writing. I cannot tell you how many cases I've had where the parent says, well, I've been telling them for years. And the simple question, did you ever put it in writing? And they're like, well, no, but they know. I mean, I've talked to everyone about it. Unfortunately, in this world, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. If you suspect your child needs special education, put the request for an evaluation in writing. You can always get a private evaluation. I mean, that is always an option to anyone who can either afford it, has insurance that can cover it. But you need to know that this is the duty of the school. And we're not going to really go into it, but there's this part of the law called child find, which mandates that the school districts must go out and they have to find children who need special education. That's their responsibility. Okay, so that's what you do if you have any suspicion whatsoever that your child might be struggling or need some help, or that something just doesn't seem right. Ask for that evaluation, and then hopefully the school district will say, yes, of course, we'll evaluate your child, and you will follow up with a meeting and go from there. So what's the obligation of the school district? So they have 14 days and they have to respond to you. Now, responding to you has to be formal, because here's what I usually see. I see what happens is the principal or the assistant principal or the teacher calls up and says, Mom, why do you think Johnny needs an evaluation? Let's talk about this. Oh, well, you know, really all the kids have problems with that. Or, you know, that's not that unusual. I've been teaching for 25 years now. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've seen just what you're, and so what's going on is they're kind of trying to talk you out of it. No, they must respond in writing, and either they hold a domain meeting, which, you know, I'll go into that a little bit, what that means, or they just flat out say, no, we're not going to evaluate your child. And then they have to provide you what we refer to as prior written notice, which is why not? And here's the data that we used to make that decision. Okay. Most of the time when they deny, what I see is that they do not provide that prior written notice, but they should. And you can ask for it. So by holding a domain meeting, all that really means is you're sitting down with the team and they're going to talk about what areas they're going to evaluate the child to determine whether or not the student requires special education. And I just want to clarify here that school districts do not diagnose kids, okay? They are not medical professionals. They don't diagnose autism. They don't diagnose dyslexia. They don't diagnose anything. What they do is they perform evaluations to determine whether or not a child needs special education. If you want a formal diagnosis, you will need to get that from a medical professional, okay? And then finally, what do you do if you disagree with the school district? Lots of things. You can go get your own evaluation and bring it back and say, you know, looky here, yes, there is something going on. My child has ADHD and can't sustain attention for more than 2.5 minutes at a time. And that's why she can't read, because no, you know, she passed all of the other reading tests and she does have the ability to make that letter sound correlation, but she can't pay attention, so she can't learn. The district then needs to consider that evaluation and say, oh, is there something here that I missed? You know, and go back and go through that process again. You can collect your own data, and boy, our parents, I mean, if there's nothing good about this pandemic, but parents, you are in the driver's seat when it comes to collecting data right now. You know, parents are telling me, I have never seen, you know, I had no idea my child did this, 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 and this. I had no idea how difficult it is for my child to sustain attention. I didn't know how much they struggled to read and how little the teacher actually assists them. So take your own data on your child. If you're not sure how to do that, you can reach out to us. We can give you some pointers, get you started, but you are in the driver's seat as far as data right now. Now, what I am seeing after all these months of being, you know, in the midst of remote and hybrid learning is that school districts are not real keen on accepting your data at this point. You know, they're kind of saying, well, gee, we don't see that on Zoom. So now it's gone from we don't see that in the classroom to we don't see that in our 15-minute Zoom session. You know, that doesn't mean that you should not do it. Do it anyway. It is, should you ever have to go to due process, it is evidence. And you're also just, you know, you're doing your own due diligence for your child and getting them what they need. Also, if the school district doesn't agree, you can file a state complaint or a due process. You can call Sabrina and I or any other advocate or attorney and get some guidance there. But, and I would add, anything you don't agree with the school district about, send them an email and tell them that you don't agree. You know, don't just let it pile up and hang out there, you know, document it all. And I'm just going to go back for 1 second. I know we had someone asking a question about homebound placement. I think we will do that question at the end. Even if we are right at 8 o'clock, we're going to answer your question regardless. Okay.
Yeah, that's a
I don't
question.
want to forget about that.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. So Judy mentioned a whole bunch. There's a ton of resources on the website and Breaking Autism's YouTube channel, so make sure you check those out. There's a sample letter for requesting an evaluation. There's tons of information around eligibility, including a timeline, which we'll go over in just a second. And Judy also mentioned, you know, writing your parental input. How do you email the school and make sure that you let them know about your concerns? There's also a section in IEP where parents provide their input, or it's called parental input. There's a video up on the YouTube channel. Make sure you watch that. It's so important that you are articulating your child's needs and your agreement or disagreement with what the school district is saying about your child, and make sure that's in writing in a way that's really going to benefit your child from an advocacy standpoint. And of course, for their actual education. So make sure you check out those resources. We've got a whole bunch of new stuff coming out as well. So subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to stay posted on that, including this recording here. But with that, let's talk about the eligibility timeline, because we've thrown some dates out at you. Let's kind of put it in order and make sure this all makes sense. So first and foremost, the child is identified as possibly needing special education services. By the way, the law allows anyone, a neighbor, a friend, a relative, parents, guardians, you name it, anyone at the school district, any private providers, to refer a child for special education. Once a child is identified as possibly needing special education, remember, in all areas of suspected disability, the child is then, assuming that the district agrees to evaluate, the child's then evaluated. I know I keep saying it, but it's so important, in all areas. This is that domain, we're talking about domain meeting. They're evaluated in all areas of suspected disability. And so that meeting, when you meet with them and figure out what you're going to evaluate, it's very, very, very important. If you feel like certain areas aren't being looked at, you know, because there's a lot of areas to evaluate even within just one diagnosis. So make sure you're looking at that. If you're not sure, reach out to an advocate, reach out to your private team as well, because sometimes there's subsets to tests, or a district might be using an old test that's no longer the latest version and might have some validity questions. So make sure you're really, truly looking at the whole picture. You wouldn't take your car in if it was making weird noises and just check the tires, right? You really want to make sure you look at everything. Obviously, your kid's more important than your car. So then, eligibility is determined in an eligibility meeting. So you have your domain meeting, then the child's evaluated, you get those, you get that evaluation back, and you meet in an eligibility meeting, which determines whether or not your child is eligible for special education. And Judy just talked about What do you do if you disagree, if your district says no, he or she is not eligible? And we've absolutely seen that in some outrageous cases where the kid so clearly needs help. So you have a lot of options. Don't just rely on this answer here, but this is the process, at least you know it. Then if the child is eligible, the IEP team convenes and writes the IEP. Remember, you're part of that IEP team. So there shouldn't be anything other than maybe an IEP draft to get started. And typically what you'll see, not always, by the way, it's fine if it's separate, where the eligibility meeting then turns into an IEP meeting where they say, yep, you know, he's eligible for he's eligible for special education. Now let's write his IEP. And so then services are provided within the IEP, right? That's where you've got your goals, your related services, all of that. And then progress is measured and reported per the IEP, or at least it should be. Districts are required to keep services logs. So if you doubt that your child's receiving all the services that they need, you can request a services log. By the way, there's a free sample letter up on the Breaking Autism website for your records request as well, and you should request records. There's also a video on the YouTube channel that shows you exactly how to measure progress, and we even use real examples, and so you can really see how maybe you would get something that shows a child's making progress, but they're actually not. So we show you some of the tricks that a lot of times districts try to use to make it look like a child's making progress when really they're not. So that is the eligibility timeline from point A to the very end, you know, point Z, I guess, and across that entire continuum. So let's talk about top 3 must-knows for writing IEP goals. We could spend so much time on just writing IEP goals, and of course, there's sessions up there about it, but let's talk about what you have to know walking in and starting to write those IEP goals. First and foremost, ask questions. Sometimes parents don't want to look dumb or they don't want to sound uninformed. Who cares? First of all, let them underestimate you. They'll prepare less and you'll get more out of it. But always ask questions. If something doesn't make sense, a lot of times IEP goals can look like jargon or what's known as the present levels of performance, which comes before you write the IEP goal. That doesn't make sense or it isn't even accurate. Ask questions about what things mean. Ask questions about the data. If you haven't seen the data to support why a goal makes sense, maybe you think your child has already accomplished the goal before it's written. Trust me, that's a thing. Maybe you think that the goal is not measurable. Ask questions. And by the way, you can call as many IEP meetings as you want. So if you have an hour's worth of questions and your school district shuts down the IEP meeting, you can call another IEP meeting. You can call as many meetings that it takes in order to provide or prepare an appropriate IEP for your child. So number 2, think about what if everyone moves. This is kind of a test Judy and I have created over the years. And that means, what if you move? Is your IEP, does it make sense on its face that if you moved and went to a new district, it would make sense to that new district? If not, there's a problem. What if somebody within the district moves? So if you get a new speech pathologist or you name it, will that goal still make sense to someone who's brand new to the team? If not, that's a major red flag and you need to stop and redraft the IEP goal. And last but not least, make sure it's measurable. Really think through this. Again, the whole reason we started with the complex law was to show you that a lot of times things look complex when they're actually very simple. Sometimes districts, not all districts, some are very good. Sometimes districts can make things sound more complicated than they really are. Don't allow it. If you don't understand the goal, ask as many questions as you need. And as Judy just said, if you're not in the IEP meeting, ask those questions in writing. And if the goal is not measurable, meaning that you can't say, you know, yep, he did X, Y, Z by this date, then it's not an appropriate IEP goal. You need to add some extra components to it. Because remember how we talked about a child must make meaningful progress. And if a goal is not measurable, there is no way to find out if a child is making meaningful progress. And that's what's so important. That's the crux of the IEP. So top 3 must-knows for writing an IEP goal. So let's talk about fundamentals to tracking IEP progress.
Right. So now that you've written that great IEP goal, and it's everything that it needs to be, you want to be able to track it and make sure that there's progress. And this is another one of those topics, and that's why this is the fundamentals tonight. This is another one of those topics. We could do a full day on this, on how to track IEP progress and to use it to help your child grow even more. But in 2 weeks, I believe the next one is on December 1st, we will be doing a full hour on tracking IEP goal progress. So we're going to go into it in depth 2 weeks from tonight. So, but what I want to talk about tonight, just, again, that overview is that anything that you can measure, like an IEP goal, you can visually chart, and boy, is that powerful. I'm telling you guys, when you can go back to the school with a visual and say, look at this, just look. You guys, have you been watching like the COVID numbers? Have you seen those charts where, it's really, really clear what's going on right now? That's what I'm talking about. You need to be able to demonstrate, and you can do this. You get that data from them, and that's our second point. Depending on what the goal is, you're going to have to get the data from the district. That is your child's data. You are entitled to it. You should be getting it on some kind of a regular basis. It's not going to just show up in your email box. You're going to have to ask for it. And then they're going to say, well, what do you mean? Well, what do you really want? And all of those things. But once you have that data, use it to make that visual, and take the time, because you know what, this is all really, really difficult. It is so overwhelming, especially at first. And I think, honestly, it takes parents, it's almost like by the time your child graduates high school, you're going, wow, I really get this now. I really understand how it works. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be this, mysterious, difficult process that you have to go through just to know whether your child is getting everything that they need. So really understand what they're telling you. And if you don't, again, we go back to ask those questions, ask an advocate, ask for help. You need to understand the data and give yourself time. And I would also say, give yourself a little bit of grace. This is difficult. It takes time. And so you just keep working at it, and you'll get better and better at it. And, in the end, you're going to be the best advocate that there can be for your child. You are the expert in your child. Don't ever, ever forget that. You are the expert. Okay, and it's 8 p.m.
All right. Well, we are going to cruise through this and answer some of your questions. You have a ton of dispute resolution options. We spent a ton of time on the last part of this special education advocacy series, going through all of your different options. When's the best time to do these things? Make sure you check out that video. It's on the Breaking Autism YouTube channel. So just type in Breaking Autism into YouTube. You'll see us up there. And there is the first part of the series, as well as we have a video podcast that really breaks down if you're going to represent yourself in a due process, for instance, how do you do that and what do you do? And that's led by Phil Milsk, the former hearing officer. So he gives you a ton of inside tips and tricks on what do you do, what are hearing officers looking for, and how is that more meaningful. So from a very high level, there are things called a facilitated IEP. That's a free process and voluntary process that's run by the state. All you have to do is request a facilitated IEP, and your district will help you, or should help you, get that set up. You can also go, if you're in Illinois, the Illinois State Board of Education's website. They have information about that as well. There are state complaints. The only caveat I would say around state complaints is if it's an issue that you want to bring up in a due process, which is just effectively a special education hearing or trial, you have to pick one or the other because you can't address both issues at the same time in a state complaint versus a due process. And then mediation as well is voluntary. You can go to mediation at any time and as many times as you want. It's free as well through the state. And then also, if you're going through due process, you also have an opportunity to go to mediation as part of that process as well. I know we flew through it, but we have a lot of time spent on it in the first part, so make sure you check that out or ask questions if you have any. Last and not least, practical tips. What do you really do? First and foremost, choose your battles, right? Make sure that you are an informed, meaningful participant in your child's education. Choose your battles. Of course, try to resolve issues collaboratively if possible. I always say, though, you're not here to make friends, right? In a year, they're going to be gone, but your child's always going to be with you. So make sure you keep that in mind. This is this is absolutely essential. Climb the administrative ladder at the district. If you're not getting anywhere with your IEP team, keep yourself moving up. You've heard us say this a billion times. Leverage your resources. There are a ton of resources. I just got an email saying, hey, can you send me some resources around this? Reach out to us. We will send you every good free resource that we have, even if it's not from Breaking Autism. And network. A lot of times parents and guardians don't realize what really is available to parents until after they talk to some other parents in the school district or outside of their school district and really realize what's available. And last but not least, invest your time. This is so important. Your child spends a lot of time in school, or they should be, and should be receiving an appropriate education, which can be a game changer, a life changer for them. And if you have questions, ask them. It is never too small of a question. Make sure you're asking questions. So with that, as I mentioned, we have a ton of resources available to you. We've got a newsletter that you can sign up for on breakingautism.com. We have a whole plethora of different videos that break down. Here's one on meaningful participation. What are your rights? Here's on how to track IEP goals. Here's what to do if you think your child's eligible for special education, differences between 504 plans and IEPs. So check that out. Basically, everything you need is at breakingautism.com or the Breaking Autism YouTube channel. We try to make it easy. And last but not least, you can always reach out to us. Here's our emails. There has never been a time that I can think of where Judy doesn't answer the question or doesn't help out. She is just an amazingly valuable resource when it comes to special education questions. So with that, let's open it up for a couple questions.
So let's take the two that came in during the presentation. The first one was when we were talking about the continuum of placement options. Someone asked, can you speak to home-based as placement? When would that be appropriate? So that is, well, it's a pretty simple answer to me. It's appropriate when it's what the child needs. It's based on unique needs. So I've had kids who were in, who had home as their placement, and these were kids primarily either medically fragile is a common reason for placement at home. Sometimes really, really bad anxiety is another reason. I think we're going to see more of that as kids try to transition back to school when this pandemic hopefully settles down. I think it's going to be hard for kids to, especially those that have those anxieties. A lot of kids are just dying to get back to school, but I'm telling you that my kids with IEPs that have anxiety, that's their primary disability, no, they are rocking it at home. They are doing great. Their grades are good and they're loving it. So, yeah, that's home-based placement. And then the other question that we had, see, I love this one, but I don't know if my answer will be helpful. So I'm interested in what Sabrina's going to say. So this was in terms of asking the district to evaluate your child. And so the question was, what happens is that they say your child's doing well in academics, and so they deny the evaluation to say that they don't suspect your child has a disability. What are the solutions to that approach other than you're going to go out and get the private evaluation?
Judy, you want to go first, or you want me to?
I was dying to answer this when it came in.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so my response to this is, so anyone can refer a child for a special education evaluation, right? And that includes parents. And the district has this darned obligation of child find, which says that they have to evaluate any child suspected of a disability. So I've gotten some rounds with some districts on this one where they say, well, no, we don't, we're not going to evaluate because we don't think the child has a disability. And so it's kind of like, but you have to evaluate because the IDEA says you have to. And I can honestly say, after all of these years, I've never had a district deny an evaluation once we've gone through that a few times. Usually they just cave and do the evaluation because the law is very clear. They have to evaluate a child suspected of a disability. Now, then they give them this weird option for saying no. And I guess that's for parents who are willing to accept no as an answer, or advocates who are willing to accept no. But that's my response. I don't think that they can refuse an evaluation.
Yeah, the only thing that they can really do is deny it, and then that has to be put in that written notice that Judy talked about. So absolutely, first and foremost, talk to an advocate, call Judy. She can help you kind of decipher what that looks like. A lot of times it's just sending them a formal letter. So make sure you check out it. That's why we have a free letter on the website, so that you can see exactly how you should say something. Of course, you can tweak it however you see fit. But when you ask exactly what you're looking for and you're very clear in your language, that can be very powerful and persuasive, if you will.
We've got one more, I think. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah.
So, how to hire the right advocate to help support. Daughter went through evaluation at eligibility, was denied in 3rd, now in 7th, is failing classes. Do I allow her to be tested again? And who do I hire to help me through the process so this doesn't happen again? Was told by school psych that daughter was not autistic, even though DX by clinical psychologist and developmental pediatrician. Where to begin? Okay.
Yeah.
So, of course, you allow her to be tested again if the district is offering to do that. If you need resources for like an outside, well, it sounds like she was diagnosed by a clinical psychologist and a developmental pediatrician. So I would say that, those would stand as diagnoses. Now, it is true, as much as I hate it, it is true that there's a difference between a medical diagnosis of autism and qualifying for an IEP under the autism eligibility at school. It is not necessarily the same thing. However, again, this is, to me, autism, and I have an autistic grown son, okay? To me, autism is a disability primarily of communication. Now that manifests in a million different ways, but it is so much about communication. And I cannot imagine someone with autism not needing some services in how to communicate. Now, do we need to be able to do that for further education, employment, and adult living? You bet we do. And it is the primary reason that adults with autism remain underemployed, not having much of a social life. I mean, I can go on and on about this, but so how to get the right help, Sabrina, I've been talking myself silly here. So yeah, I mean, I feel really strongly about this.
No kidding. No kidding. So first and foremost, to the last two questions actually, or everyone here, we've never once mentioned grades. They are so subjective. And as we learned earlier, right, they are one data point. That's it. So grades are not entirely irrelevant, but they're just a data point. If that's what they're using, frankly, that's worthy of at least, you need to really consider some of your dispute resolution options very seriously. Especially, here's the other thing you said, that they were denied in 3rd grade and now they're struggling in 7th grade. There's something called compensatory education, which allows you to go back. Listen to this. It's really important because this is another area they try to trick you. 2 years from the day the parents knew or should have known. So if you're just finding out now when your kid's in 7th grade that they needed all of these services back in 3rd grade, or frankly, even before when they entered the district, you can get compensatory education for all of that. And it's not a day for day. It is whatever it takes to get your child to where they should have been, but for the district's denial. So if your child would have been at grade level by now, they've got it, and it's going to take 12 more years to get them there. I mean, I know I'm being extreme, but then that's what compensatory education is. It doesn't matter if they only missed a year or 5 or 4 or whatever it might be. So you need to really, really consider that, because the district has, and that could be private services, that could be, a lot of times what we'll do is work out a settlement where the parents get to pick the provider, or, you know, the district and the parents work together to pick out how those services are going to be, you know, either implemented at school or privately, and then there's a push-in or at home. I mean, there, again, a whole continuum of even compensatory services. So really, really, really think hard about that. The other thing is, get a good advocate. I cannot tell you how important that is. Make sure you're asking people some really, really core questions. Make sure they have a really extensive background. A little check, if you're just looking for like a litmus test right now, ask them, do you think that I need a remote learning plan? And if they say yes, you should probably run, you know? Any good advocate understands the legal significance of an IEP as it relates to a child with special education needs. And it is so different than a remote learning plan. And I keep seeing all of these, you know, posts, make sure you ask for a remote learning plan. That's a very inexperienced advocate. Ask references, ask for references,
Yeah.
network, because you need somebody. And it's disgusting, it's horrible, but we see it so many times with doctors, providers, advocates, even attorneys. Don't take an attorney who doesn't know special education law. It is so complex. There's so much information out there that can steer you in the wrong direction. You know, as an attorney, you can practice basically any kind of law. There's some caveats, right, with class actions and stuff like that.
You know,
but just because you're an attorney doesn't mean you're no special education.
I'm going to throw this out there, okay, guys? I have right now 3 clients on my caseload who are attorneys, okay?
Very good point. That's a very good point.
It really humbles me, okay? But they are just like, you know what? I can do contracts. I can do this. I can do real estate. I can do that. I cannot handle this. It's just too much. I don't, you know, and I don't have the, you know, and so it becomes very emotional when it's your child, right?
Yes.
You know,
it's
a whole different ball game.
Just because someone has a special needs child doesn't make them an advocate. Just because they have a certain certification doesn't make them a good advocate. make sure you're asking really core questions like, can you show me how to, monitor my child's progress? If they can't answer those kinds of questions, they might be a little bit too junior in their career to be able to help your child. And I'm not saying they won't be a good advocate at some point, but I just don't know if that's something you want to leave to chance with your child. So I'll leave it at that. I could go on, but Judy, I don't even wonder how many cases you have where there was a bad advocate involved, so,
yeah,
or attorney for that matter.
It does happen. And the final thing I want to say is just because your child doesn't qualify doesn't mean, some kids just don't qualify for special education. It's just the reality. So then, it's what else can we do to make sure your child is successful? That's really what it's all about. So, all right.
All right. I know we're over. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will see you in 2 weeks. Quick correction on my part. In 2 weeks, we are talking about measuring your IEP goals. Okay. And then in 4 weeks, we're talking about your procedural safeguards. So make sure you check those out and register now. Check out the YouTube site, the YouTube channel as well, and breakingautism.com. Reach out with any questions. Shannon, Amanda, anything you would add to that?
No, if you want the slides, we're happy to send them out to you, and we'll get the video posted. Sabrina and Judy will on their YouTube. I put the link to the survey. Just another, good plug for it.
We have one question up here, and I'm going to answer it very quickly. It came in before I saw. If a student has autism SLD and is 4 grades behind academically, but the team won't provide one-to-one support to help the student and reach the goals, what should the parent do? My quick answer to that is that if one-to-one support is not necessarily what your child needs, a lot of times, I'm not sure what this parent is asking, but a one-to-one paraprofessional is no guarantee of anything for your child. They are not, they're not teachers. They are so that's not necessarily the answer. The question is, if your child is not closing the gap, what do? You get serious about it and go back to the district for compensatory education.
It sounds like the child needs a very intense intervention. Right. I don't think a paraprofessional could be somebody who's just out of high school. There's in most states, there's almost no regulation around it. There's some, but it could really be anyone. And not to say that they, I haven't worked with some really great paraprofessionals. I even know districts who will assign different, professionals as a parapro or a one-on-one. Sometimes you hear the call one-on-one aid. By the way, there is a difference. If you don't know the difference, write that down. We should talk about it. But yeah, it sounds like your child needs some intervention. It's too late for an aid. And I'd go back to district and say, you know what, you're right. They don't need an aid. We need to talk about some intervention in combat.
Yeah, they need progress, not an aid.
Yeah. Very good point. How about that for a closer, huh? Good. All right, gang. It was so nice to see everyone. Thank you for your questions, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Have a good evening,
Good night.
everyone.
Bye.